All game series evolve over time, but some definitely way more than others. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 game series that have changed drastically over time. Starting off at number 10, let's do one of the more obvious ones out there, the Resident Evil series. Now, this is a series of video games that aesthetically usually retain a lot of similarities, but mechanically over time have transcended genre in so many ways. The first three, of course, are tank-controlled survival horror. 4 came to the Wii and introduced some very different controls. Then 5 and 6 were pretty much pure action games. 7 more or less feels fully horror-focused, despite jumping into first person. But it's actually more similar to the originals than anyone anticipated. And then somehow the Resident Evil 2 remake manages to combine basically everything except for 7 into a single thing that feels authentic to Resident Evil as a series, Resident Evil 2 itself, and also something unto itself, which is bizarre. Honestly, my hope is that future Resident Evil games operate a lot like Resident Evil 2 Remake. It's a frickin' beast. Moving on to number 9, Doom, which Doom is basically the granddaddy of all FPSs, although it wasn't really the first, it just certainly had the most influence. That said, the original Doom 1 and 2 were pretty specifically fast-paced, twitchy, frenetic, chaotic-feeling games. And Doom 3 was survival horror? When they were like, let's make Doom 3, they were also like, let's do a completely different thing and call it Doom. And that's not to say that Doom 3 was like awful or anything. It definitely wasn't as good as the original games. Like, a big part of why it feels like a significant game at all is really just aesthetics, atmosphere, etc. Other than that, it's actually kind of a generic shooter, albeit one with narrative elements, not something the first two had. But when they rebooted the Doom franchise in 2016, they basically went for much more minimalized narrative elements and went back to the run-and-gun, fast-paced, chaotic gameplay that made Doom really as fun as it is. I think it was probably the right choice. I mean, I think Doom is Doom, and if you don't do it that way, why call it Doom? Coming in at number 8, MechWarrior is a series that I've actually really loved through the years in its several different iterations. Battletech is what it's based on. It's a tabletop board game / RPG. And the original MechWarrior game is kind of attempting to do that. It's basically an RPG that drops you into a mech for FPS segments. But then MechWarrior 2 and 3 just go full-out mech simulator, which honestly, that's where I really thought the series picked up serious steam. And MechWarrior 4, while it wasn't something I would call bad, it was definitely much more streamlined and simplistic, maybe even arcade-like. Now, I've heard different things about MechWarrior 5, the upcoming game. First, I've heard simulator multiple times. I mean, it's not like a management sim where you build like a mech company or anything. We're talking more along the lines of the MechWarrior 2 and 3 mech simulator type simulator. But I've also heard the word streamlined more than once. Being I haven't really been able to get my hands on it, I have hopes that it's somewhere between MechWarrior 2 and 3 and MechWarrior 4. I think if you release 2 and 3 today, it might be a bit too much. Whereas I think if you just went for a full-bore arcade version of this, it would be kinda generic. I am just happy there's a new MechWarrior game coming out, so we'll see. Moving on to number 7, the Zelda series. Like, the original Zelda games are kind of the genesis of action RPGs in a lot of ways. Again, they're not the first by any means, but they were the first complete package that got the kind of attention that it did. And through the years, it developed those action RPG elements and then kind of walked back on them. Now, this isn't to say like I have some sort of problem with Wind Waker. I think Wind Waker is actually a brilliant, amazing game, but it's also kind of a bit more of an adventure game than an action RPG. There is combat in it, obviously, but it's not that complicated, and there's not a lot of major RPG elements to it. Skyward Sword was along the same lines, but Breath of the Wild then brought so much back into it and cleverly limited some elements while making some just utterly limitless, and ended up creating something that I think is one of the better RPGs of all time. Every new Zelda, you can basically expect it's something new, and truthfully, after all these years, it's really appreciated to have something that stays fresh so consistently. Coming in at number 6, Dynasty Warriors over its long lifespan actually stayed very similar for a large number of games. The two big developments in the series happened between the very first game and the actual very last game, but they're big developments. One's positive, one not so much. The original Dynasty Warriors was a fighting game, like a Soul Calibur style fighting game. And I'm not saying it's a fighting game to make a value judgment on it. I don't know that I would consider it to be top tier fighting games. In fact, when you're kind of a Soul Calibur-like game when Soul Calibur exists, it's kinda, what you doing here? But obviously it evolved into something much, much more, very quickly, might I add. The Dynasty Warriors Horde battle really took off and stayed the same for a long time until the last iteration of the game, in which they added an open world, and it sucked. The battles are still fun. I mean, that's what Dynasty Warriors is. That's what matters to people who like the series. But the open world really messes up the flow and the fun, at least in my opinion. Coming in at number 5, Castlevania has had 3, I would say, distinct eras of its existence. The first era, which started with the 1986 Nintendo game, had 6 areas with 3 stages, and was ultimately just a tough action platformer. For its time, it was a really good game, too. As it moved into its second era, though, it became a side-scrolling action RPG with one big interconnected world map. We know the genre Metroidvania because of this era of the game, combined with the fact that Metroid did the same thing. These two games popularizing that form of game probably more than anything else. And then a third era in which it was a 3D hack and slash, which, If you really want a new Castlevania game that is not just a retread but adds its own stuff to it, Koji Igarashi, one of the lead producers on the Castlevania series back in the glory days, created Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. I'd say that's better than a 3D hack and slash Castlevania any day. Nothing wrong with 3D hack and slashes, but at some point you just miss Castlevania. Moving on to number 4 is Final Fantasy, which started off as a very standard turn-based JRPG, high fantasy elements, everything you would expect it to be. And as time passed, Final Fantasy became something much, much more. Now, we've had high fantasy Final Fantasy games, of course, but since it's evolved, we've had Industrial Revolution Final Fantasy games. We've had Cyberpunk Final Fantasy games. We've had whatever Final Fantasy VIII is Final Fantasy games. And we've even moved away from the traditional JRPG turn-based mode of combat over to another in Final Fantasy XV, which actually created a pretty good battle system, which again is kind of a continuation of Kingdom Hearts. That's carrying over to some extent to Final Fantasy VII's remake, which actually looks like it's going to bring a lot of interesting stuff to the table, having 2 forms of combat, one meant to kind of be a hybrid turn-based real-time, and 2 meant to kind of evolve the Final Fantasy XV/Kingdom Hearts way. If you're unfamiliar with the Final Fantasy series, looking at it might make it look like a bit of a mess, but honestly, it's created some of the most enjoyable experiences of any series, and it's consistently done it through the years. Moving on to number 3, Fire Emblem is a strategic JRPG tactics game, and through the years it's consistently been that. However, it's continually added more elements of life sims to it that have culminated in Fire Emblem Three Houses, basically being this really elaborate school life simulator as well as being a strategy/tactics game that really excels at both elements of itself. We really started to see this stuff in Fire Emblem Awakening, which added in relationship building as an element to the game, and also it's really gotten way better at storytelling through the years. Now, I know that doesn't really affect the genre it sits in, however, the early games were really samey, and if you played them back to back, they would blend together pretty bad. That's not to say they were bad, they actually have always been good games, but it's added other elements of genre to it, while getting better at narrative, in a manner where the genre and the narrative almost coincide. Moving on to number 2, Tomb Raider is a game that started off very much as a sort of dungeon crawly puzzle game with a ton of action and gun-based combat. Now, I think you could kind of describe the newer games as that, but they definitely don't exist in the same genre as the original Tomb Raider games. First, there is a load of cover-based shooting, which very much changes the kind of gameplay you're engaging in. And if you're good at it, stealth is an option in a lot of cases. There are puzzles in the new games, but they definitely take a backseat to the action. And I wouldn't really call the environmental traversal in these games necessarily platforming, whereas in the originals I definitely would. They certainly have platforming elements, but they definitely mirror the sort of spectacle-oriented stuff that you might see in Uncharted. Not that Uncharted itself doesn't take a massive amount of influence from those original Tomb Raider games. It's just these are fundamentally different games. Not that they're better or worse. Honestly, I like all the Tomb Raider games for different reasons, but I like them about equally. Which, considering how different they actually are now, is a pretty big feat. And finally, at number 1, Mario. Mario is a set of games that is just nothing like where it started. I mean, do you play as Mario? Do you jump onto platforms, go through pipes, etc., etc.? Sure. But the major innovation of the original games was the games themselves. A platformer like that just didn't exist, not in such a well put together and complex manner anyhow. And the thing those games did probably the best was in fact level design. The original set of Mario games, starting with Super Mario Bros. And landing on Super Mario World more or less, are basically a triumph. And in truth, so are the Yoshi's Island games, which share a lot of elements. I mean, you can't not call them a 2D platformer, but everything about it is different. Is it primarily about jumping on platforms and enemies? Absolutely not. In a lot of respects, it's almost an escort mission game. But then we also have to account for Super Mario 64, which brought us into the collectathon era of Mario. Now, what's interesting about Mario is despite the fact that they create new genres for Mario, they keep making new games for each genre. We've gotten new Super Mario Bros. Games, and they are a welcome addition to the original platformers, in my opinion. We've gotten more collectathons. In fact, Super Mario Odyssey is probably the best one out of all the collectathon games. And it also merges different elements of different genres into areas of its levels. But there's also Super Mario 3D Land and 3D World, which are course-based 3D games that have controls similar to the collectathons, but level design similar to 3D versions of the 2D games. Then we also have the Mario Maker games, which are, for all intents and purposes, 2D platformers, however, also creation tool sets. Mario transcends genre probably more than any other character out there, and that franchise does it really well. What do you think? What are some games that you like that have switched genres over the years? Leave us a comment, let us know what you think, and click like if you enjoyed this video. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe and click the notification bell. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at FalconHero, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.